It's been a while since I've talked about international affairs and foreign policy, so I think it's about time we make another one. Today I'll discuss the formula for why countries tend to see violent political conflict, be it rebellions, insurgencies, civil wars, terrorism, or other forms of political violence, internally from their own citizens, rather than from foreign influence, although that part is definitely a factor that exponentially increases violence. The first thing to discuss is grievances, which are issues that a population has with their own government. Now, the higher the grievances, and depending on the severity, such as if starvation is an issue, then people would of course be more willing to take up arms against an incumbent government or engage in forms of violent political demonstration, such as riots. Additionally, the capabilities of those with grievances will impact violent political conflict. For example, if they have automatic weapons or Molotov cocktails, that changes their level of willingness to engage in conflict with the government, compared to if they had nothing. State response will also influence how the grievances and number of anti-government groups grow or diminish. State coercion can either immediately halt anti-government violence or accelerate it. If a state has no response, then of course the protesters and rioters will exponentially grow and escalate the violence. On the other hand, if a state conducts a very harsh crackdown, it can inspire even more resistance. This is of course what leads to the next mechanism, which is regime type. Regime type also has a huge impact on violent political conflict. If a democratic state is the one facing resistance, then they are limited to how they can respond because a democracy runs on public perception of the incumbent leadership. Meanwhile, an authoritarian state, on the other hand, can do a harsh crackdown without many repercussions from inside the state, as a dictator or ruling body don't have to care about public perception as long as they have the loyalty of the security forces. The next major factor regarding violent political conflict is foreign influence. Now, foreign influence can be something small like spreading disinformation or encouraging mass protests. However, it can also be as drastic as training rebels, providing equipment and intel for insurgent groups to overthrow the government, which was pretty common throughout the Cold War, and kinda common now. The last major factor in violent political conflict is, of course, the security forces defection. Now, I've already made a video on security forces defections, but basically, since the state security forces, like military and police, are the state's monopoly on violence, so when elements of these forces turn against the state, then either a coup or full-on civil war tends to happen. Again, I already did a video on this, so if you want more on that aspect, then go watch it. A first major case study is the Russian Empire. By 1917, grievances against the former Tsarist regime and the Kerensky provisional government had grown so high among the population that protests, strikes, and riots were common occurrences. Not to get too deep into the complexities of Russia in World War I, but the conditions were set for violent political conflicts. The government had seen the Tsar as an extremely incompetent leader, as Russia was losing the war hardcore, and he stepped down. Then the Kerensky government made the very unpopular decision to stay in the war, where Russia saw a lot of political scheming, protests, attempted coups, and general instability happen. So the conditions were set for the October Revolution and the following Russian Civil War. Elements of the military were split between both factions. Radicalism and crazy ideologies of all kinds existed on both sides as well. The point were that there were high grievances, mass protests met with initially hard crackdowns, but would then amount to little to no state responses. Security forces would defect, and then came the Civil War. Another example is the fall of the USSR. Now, life in the Soviet Union sucked pretty bad, and by the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev had enacted the Glasnost and Perestroika reforms in the USSR to bring some freedoms to the state, as the population preferred the amazingness over McDonald's over the terribleness of communism. Additionally, stagnation was getting pretty bad as grievances grew. Furthermore, the Baltic states had been demanding independence for some time, as the Warsaw Pact had dissolved in 1989, and the Soviets were involved in conflicts throughout Central and Western Asia. In August of 1991, Soviet hardliners attempted a coup to put the USSR back into a reactionary commie state, but the public wasn't having any of it. Additionally, most of the military refused orders from the hardliners, and the USSR would implode later that year. Post-World War I Weimar Germany is also a prime example of violent political conflict. You see, the German government was pretty weak, and there were paramilitary organizations of all ideologies. Whenever one would attempt a coup, then the Weimar government would partially rely on the others to keep the state alive. Additionally, everyone was broke, and there was hyperinflation. Violence was very common throughout interwar Germany, as everyone had grievances against everyone, especially after losing a war and having the heavy conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. Eventually, the Nazis, of course, would rise to power by thriving in this chaotic environment of political conflict. Germany and Russia are prime examples of the dangers of violent political conflict because a polarizing, radical, and authoritarian ideology can seize power in an environment of mass instability. Now, a major case study involving foreign influence is, of course, the Spanish Civil War. You see, in 1936, after the election witnessed a Republican victory, the Nationalists decided not to recognize it due to mass grievances against the Republican government and decided to seize power for themselves. However, massive foreign support came for the Republican government in the form of the International Brigades. Then the Nationalists received direct German and Italian troops, and the Soviets sent in forces to directly fight for various Republican factions. But they were more so there to purge certain factions on the Republican side. The Civil War would last until 1939 with a Nationalist victory. Other case studies throughout the Cold War have high levels of foreign involvement, such as the Angolan Civil War, where Cuba launched Operation Carlotta to send a total of somewhere between 337,000 to 380,000 troops to bring about a communist victory for the People's Republic of Angola against the Democratic People's Republic of Angola just after the end of the Angolan War of Independence. Another case study is the Iranian Revolution, where the Shah's authoritarian but still considerably free state was forcefully overthrown by radical student protesters following Ayatollah Khomeini. Grievances existed over the Shah's oppressive mechanisms and entities such as the Savak secret police organization. Although there would be limited security forces defections, the military would be preoccupied fighting several other insurgencies within the country, and then Iran became a theocratic totalitarian state, which exists today at the time of this video in July of 2025. Now, there can, of course, be other mechanisms classified as X factors, such as social media. A solid example being in the Arab Spring, where people used social media to communicate, organize, and gather pro-democracy demonstrations to demand authoritarian states stand down. There would be limited successes in countries in the Middle East and North Africa, most notably being Tunisia, and Mubarak standing down in Egypt, while other states like Saudi Arabia crushed the demonstrations, and then there's cases like Syria and Libya where a civil war was the result. Of course, there's a ton of other examples of violent political conflict with many different mechanisms holding stronger or weaker positions within the formula. But this was merely a summary. Let me know in the comments any other good examples that you can think of, and thank you for watching.